In the summer of 1960, deep in the Mexican town of Cuernavaca, about 2 hours south of Mexico City, a film crew was preparing to shoot one of the most iconic westerns of all time. The Magnificent Seven told the story of 7 gunfighters hired to protect a desperate Mexican village from bandits, and the cast assembled for this production read like a who's who of Hollywood tough guys. There was Yul Brynner, fresh off his success in The King and I and the 10 Commandments, a legitimate movie star with his name above the title. There was Steve McQueen, the rising golden boy who just finished his breakout TV show Wanted Dead or Alive, bringing that natural charisma and cool that would define his entire career. James Coburn, Robert Vaughn, Brad Dexter, and Horst Buchholz rounded out the group. And then there was Charles Bronson. Unlike the others, Bronson wasn't a star and wasn't on his way to becoming one, at least not yet. He'd been working steadily for 10 years, but always in small parts, character roles where he played the heavy, the thug, the guy who never got the girl and usually died before the third act. At 39 years old, he was just a working actor, grateful to have the job and not expecting to stand out in this ensemble of rising and established stars. He was playing Bernardo O'Reilly, an Irish-Mexican gunfighter who was skilled with knives and had a way with children, a supporting role that looked pretty ordinary on paper. On the first day of filming, director John Sturges gathered the cast for rehearsal because he wanted them to work together and build real chemistry. He knew that 7 men had to look like they'd ridden together, fought together, and trusted each other with their lives, and you can't fake that kind of bond. You have to build it. So they all sat around a table, reading through scenes, getting a feel for their characters and each other. Steve McQueen was doing what Steve McQueen did best, which was performing. He was making interesting choices, adding little bits of business, trying things out, being watchable and dynamic because he understood instinctively how cameras worked and how to steal a scene. It was a natural gift, that magnetic charisma that made people unable to look away. Yul Brynner watched with approval, recognizing that this kid knew exactly what he was doing and how to command attention. Then they came to a scene with Bronson, a simple moment where village children approached the gunfighters wanting to know if they were brave, if they were heroes. Bronson's character had to talk to them and explain something philosophical, that heroes and cowards are really the same, that it all just depends on the moment and the choice you make. On the page, it was a little heavy, the kind of dialogue that could easily become boring if an actor played it wrong or tried too hard to make it profound. But when Bronson read those lines, something completely different happened. He didn't perform them at all. He just said them, simple and direct, as if he were actually talking to real children instead of acting like he was talking to children. There's a profound difference between those two approaches, and everyone in that room felt it immediately. The atmosphere shifted. Something authentic had just occurred. McQueen stopped performing entirely and leaned forward, now watching Bronson with genuine interest, really studying what he was doing and how he was doing it. When they broke for lunch, McQueen sought out Bronson and asked him about that scene they'd just read. He wanted to know how Bronson had made it feel so real, not like acting at all, but like he actually believed every word he was saying. Bronson looked genuinely confused by the question and asked what McQueen meant. McQueen tried to explain that it felt different, more truthful somehow, not like a performance. Bronson's response was simple and direct. He said he did believe it, every single word, because if he was going to say something, he had to believe it, otherwise what was the point of saying it at all? This answer made McQueen pause and think because his training had been completely different. He'd studied at the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg, learning the method, which was all about technique and finding the character and building a performance through conscious choices and careful construction. But Bronson wasn't talking about any of that. He was talking about belief, about truth, about simply meaning what you say. McQueen asked where Bronson had trained, and Bronson admitted he really hadn't, not in any formal way. He'd taken some classes on the GI Bill after the war, but mostly he just worked and learned by doing, by trial and error, by showing up and being present. When McQueen asked if Bronson had been in the war, Bronson confirmed he'd served in the Air Force as a gunner on IB-29 bomber, flying 25 combat missions over the Pacific. McQueen went quiet at this because he tried to enlist himself but had been too young, and by the time he was old enough, the war had ended. He'd always felt like he'd missed something important, missed that crucible that transforms boys into men. But Bronson clearly had that experience. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in how he occupied space with that quiet authority. He'd been tested in situations where hesitation meant death, where you couldn't fake your way through or perform your courage. You either had it or you didn't, and if you didn't, you died. McQueen asked what that experience had been like, flying those combat missions, and Bronson was quiet for a long time before answering. Finally, he said it teaches you something fundamental about fear and courage, about what's real and what's just pretend. When you're in a bomber at 30,000 feet with enemy fighters coming at you and flak exploding all around you, you can't act brave. You either are brave or you aren't, and if you aren't, you die. Then he paused before adding that acting is actually the same way. If you're just pretending to be brave, the camera sees right through it and so does the audience. But if you actually are brave, if you genuinely believe that what you're doing matters, people feel that authenticity and they trust it completely. McQueen was processing this new perspective when he asked if Bronson meant he didn't act at all. Bronson smiled, which was rare for him, and said he tried not to act in the traditional sense. Instead, he tried to just be, to exist in the moment with complete honesty, to let the character live through him rather than performing the character from the outside. McQueen pointed out that this wasn't what they taught in acting schools, and Bronson's smile widened slightly as he said that maybe that's exactly why it worked so well. When filming actually began, the first major scene showed the 7 gunfighters riding into the village while frightened, hopeful, desperate peasants watched from doorways and windows. The 7 men dismounted and walked through the village, and Sturges wanted to establish each character through their behavior and actions rather than through dialogue. McQueen had carefully planned his performance with little touches like adjusting his hat just so, checking his gun with practiced ease, shaking dust from his boots with casual grace. These were the kinds of details that made him interesting and watchable, the things cameras love to capture. Bronson didn't do any of that calculated performing. He just walked naturally, looking around, observing his surroundings, noticing children hiding in doorways and behind their mothers' skirts. He knelt down and smiled at them, not making it a big moment or trying to draw attention to himself, just creating a simple human connection. The children responded by coming closer and touching his jacket tentatively. One bold little girl gathered her courage and asked if he was a hero. Bronson's character looked at her directly and said quietly that no, he wasn't a hero, he was just a man trying to do a little better today than he did yesterday. Director Sturges called cut after just one take and said it was perfect. He turned to his cinematographer and asked if he'd seen what Bronson had just done. The cinematographer nodded and said Bronson had made it completely real, had made everyone watching forget they were watching a movie at all. Sturges agreed enthusiastically and said that's exactly what they needed for this film, more of that authentic being and less of that calculated performing. He gathered the entire cast together and told them to watch what Bronson did, to notice how he didn't act scenes but instead lived them moment to moment. Sturges wanted all of them to try that approach, to just be present and exist in the moment, to trust the material and trust themselves rather than constructing elaborate performances. McQueen heard this direction clearly and looked over at Bronson, but Bronson wasn't gloating or showing any pride at being singled out for praise. He was just listening quietly and waiting for the next setup, ready to work. Over the next 6 weeks of filming in Mexico, something fundamental began to change in McQueen's approach. He started performing less and simply being more. He stopped trying to steal scenes with clever bits of business and instead tried to genuinely live in those scenes from moment to moment. His performance became quieter, more internal, more grounded in authentic emotion. When he shared scenes with Bronson, instead of competing for attention, he listened and responded naturally, letting each moment develop organically. The chemistry between them became electric, and their scenes together became some of the best material in the entire film. There was one particular scene that captured this transformation perfectly. The 7 gunfighters were sitting around a campfire the night before a major battle, each man knowing that some of them wouldn't survive to see the next sunset. Each character dealt with this reality in his own way. Some joked to mask their fear, some drank to numb it, some prayed for divine protection. Bronson's character methodically sharpened his knives, calm and focused, preparing himself mentally and physically. McQueen's character watched him for a while before finally asking if he was scared. Bronson didn't look up from his work, just kept the rhythmic motion of the whetstone against the blade and said he was scared every single time. McQueen observed that Bronson didn't look scared at all, and Bronson explained that's because he'd learned something important over the years. Fear is just a feeling, he said, and what really matters is what you choose to do with that feeling. You can let it control you and paralyze you, or you can use it as fuel to sharpen your focus and strengthen your resolve. McQueen asked how someone learns to do that, how to transform fear into fuel, and Bronson finally looked up from his knife and met McQueen's eyes. He said you have to accept that you might die, really accept it deep in your bones, not just say the words but feel the truth of your own mortality. And then you decide that if you are going to die, you want to die doing something that matters, something true and real. The fear doesn't disappear, Bronson explained, but it stops controlling you once you've made peace with the worst possible outcome. McQueen was quiet for a moment, absorbing this wisdom, and then he said something that wasn't in the script at all. He said he thought he'd been scared his whole life, scared of not being good enough, not being man enough, not living up to what people expected of him. Bronson nodded with understanding and said most men carry that same fear, which is exactly why we all pretend and put on masks and act tougher than we really feel. But real courage, he explained, isn't about pretending you're not scared. Real courage is about being genuinely scared and choosing to act anyway, choosing to do what needs to be done despite the fear. Director Sturges was watching this exchange from behind the monitor with tears streaming down his face. He whispered to his assistant director that they were keeping every single word of this improvised dialogue, that this was the real heart of the movie right here. Not the explosions or the gunfights or the choreographed action, but this moment of two men talking honestly about fear and courage and what it means to be a man. When The Magnificent Seven was released in November of 1960, critics generally liked it and audiences absolutely loved it, and it went on to become one of the greatest and most influential westerns ever made. Everyone noticed Steve McQueen and recognized this as his true star-making performance, showcasing that effortless cool and natural charisma that would define his entire career. They noticed Yul Brynner as the strong leader and anchor of the group, exactly what the studio had intended and paid for. These were the performances everyone was supposed to notice and remember. But something unexpected happened that the studio hadn't anticipated at all. Audiences also noticed Charles Bronson in a big way, not because he was flashy or stealing scenes, but because every single moment he appeared on screen felt completely authentic and lived in. People believed him implicitly, trusted him completely, and found themselves wanting to see more of him. Critics began mentioning him specifically in their reviews. One wrote that Bronson brings a weight and gravitas to his scenes that somehow elevates everyone else around him. Another observed that in a cast full of stars and rising stars, Bronson manages to shine by refusing to try to shine at all, by simply existing with such complete authenticity that his presence becomes magnetic. This reaction was even stronger in Europe, particularly in France, where Bronson unexpectedly became the breakout star of the film, eclipsing even McQueen and Brynner in critical acclaim. French film critics wrote lengthy essays analyzing his performance and his unique presence on screen. They argued that he represented something American cinema had been losing, a kind of fundamental authenticity and truth and realness that couldn't be manufactured or performed. They called him an actor who doesn't act, a star who doesn't perform being a star, someone who simply is with such complete conviction that it becomes art. When Steve McQueen saw these reviews and read what critics were saying about Bronson's performance, he wasn't jealous or resentful. He was genuinely grateful because Bronson had taught him something invaluable on that Mexican film set, something far more valuable than any scene-stealing technique or camera trick. Bronson had shown him that less is more, that truth beats performance every single time, that audiences don't want to watch actors acting but instead want to believe they're witnessing something real and true. McQueen carried this lesson forward through his entire legendary career. In films like Bullet, The Great Escape, Papillon, and The Getaway, all the movies that cemented his status as an icon, he performed less and simply was more. He learned to trust silence, to trust stillness, to trust that being completely authentic is infinitely more powerful than trying to be interesting or impressive. He became known as the king of cool not by trying to be cool, but by being absolutely real and authentic. He was doing exactly what Bronson had taught him in Mexico in 1960. Years later in 1974, when McQueen was at the absolute peak of his fame as the biggest movie star in Hollywood, he was asked in an interview who had taught him the most about acting over the course of his career. McQueen didn't hesitate for even a second. He said Charles Bronson. The reporter was genuinely surprised by this answer and asked if he really meant Bronson rather than Lee Strasberg or Yul Brynner or any of the great directors he'd worked with over the years. McQueen explained that all those other people had taught him valuable techniques and approaches, but Bronson had taught him something much more fundamental. He'd taught him truth. He'd taught him that acting isn't about showing people how talented you are or how well you can perform. It's about showing people who you really are underneath all the pretense and performance. And that's infinitely harder and scarier and more real. The reporter pressed for more details, asking what specifically Bronson had taught him, and McQueen told the story of that night around the campfire, that improvised conversation about fear and courage and acceptance. He said Bronson told him something that fundamentally changed his entire approach to his career. Real courage, Bronson had said, isn't about pretending you're not scared. It's about being genuinely terrified and choosing to act anyway. McQueen explained that he applied this same principle to his acting. He stopped pretending he wasn't scared of being vulnerable on camera, stopped hiding behind elaborate techniques and carefully constructed performances. He started just being himself, scared and real and fully human. And that's when his career truly took off and reached heights he'd never imagined possible. The reporter asked if McQueen had ever thanked Bronson for this gift, and McQueen smiled and said he thanked him every single time they crossed paths. And Bronson, being exactly who he was, always responded the same way. He'd say that McQueen already knew all of this deep down, that he'd just reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That was who Bronson was as a person, someone who would give you the most valuable lesson of your life and then refuse to take any credit for teaching it. The Magnificent Seven fundamentally changed action films, not just because of its plot structure or its exciting gunfights, but because of the depth and authenticity of its performances. It demonstrated that action heroes don't have to be invincible or superhuman. They can be scared, they can be vulnerable, they can be completely real and human. And that reality actually makes them more heroic, not less, because we can see ourselves in them and believe that we too might find courage when it's needed most. Charles Bronson established a template with this performance that influenced every action star who came after him. Clint Eastwood built his entire iconic persona on this foundation, playing men who don't try to prove anything but simply exist with quiet, lethal competence. Liam Neeson in Taken brought that same energy decades later, calm and methodical and absolutely real. Keanu Reeves in John Wick uses minimal dialogue and maximum authentic presence. They're all following the template that Bronson established, whether they realize it or not. Be real, be authentic, let the audience project themselves onto you instead of performing at them from a distance. But here's what most people miss when they analyze Bronson's influence. He didn't invent this style or consciously create this approach as an artistic choice. He simply lived it because it was who he actually was. He wasn't playing at being quiet and tough. He genuinely was quiet and tough because the coal mines and the war and 20 years of constant rejection had forged him into exactly that kind of man. When he showed up on that Mexican film set in 1960, he wasn't trying to be revolutionary or different or groundbreaking. He was just being himself, showing up as the only person he knew how to be. And being completely himself turned out to be absolutely revolutionary. Steve McQueen had to consciously learn how to do what came naturally to Bronson. He had to unlearn all his training and technique and carefully constructed performance strategies. He had to learn to stop trying so hard and just be present and authentic. Bronson taught him this profound lesson, not through lectures or acting exercises or intellectual discussions, but simply through example. By showing up every single day and being authentically himself, being true to who he was, being real in every moment. That's the real story beneath the surface of the Magnificent Seven. Yes, it's about 7 gunfighters protecting a village from bandits, but on a deeper level it's about 7 actors learning together what it means to be truly real on camera. And one of them, Charles Bronson, showed all the others how to do it, not because he was trying to teach them or demonstrate superior technique, but simply because he was being himself without apology or pretense. And being himself, it turned out, was more than enough. It was everything. So here's the fundamental lesson that applies far beyond acting or filmmaking. You don't have to perform your competence for other people. You don't have to constantly prove that you're good enough or smart enough or talented enough. You don't have to put on an elaborate show. Just be authentic. Be real. Be true to who you actually are and what you genuinely believe. People will feel that authenticity radiating from you. They'll trust it instinctively. They'll respond to it powerfully. Not because it's flashy or impressive or attention-grabbing, but because it's real. And real is incredibly rare in this world. Real is genuinely valuable. Real is what people are desperately hungry for even if they can't articulate that hunger. Steve McQueen learned this from Charles Bronson and went on to become one of the biggest and most beloved stars in cinema history by applying that single lesson consistently. You can learn the same lesson and apply it to whatever you do. Stop performing for others. Stop trying so hard to impress people. Stop pretending to be something you think you should be instead of who you actually are. Just be. Just exist. Just show up as your complete, authentic self. That's harder than any performance you could construct. That's scarier than any role you could play. But that's also what makes you truly unforgettable. Charles Bronson taught Steve McQueen this lesson in Mexico in 1960. It changed McQueen's entire career trajectory. It changed what action films could be. It changed what audiences expected from their heroes. And Bronson did all of this not by giving lectures or showing off his superior understanding, but simply by being himself, by being real and authentic when everyone else around him was performing and constructing and trying. By understanding that the camera sees absolutely everything, and what it sees most clearly is the truth. And the truth, always and forever, is infinitely more powerful than even the most skilled performance.